A hush fell over the Supreme Court chamber as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett strode to the podium, her emerald green suit a vibrant contrast against the somber mahogany backdrop. Just moments before, Justice Samuel Alito had unleashed a barrage of pointed questions at the young Texas representative, his voice laced with patronizing disdain. "Congresswoman Crockett, you seem to lack basic understanding of constitutional principles," he'd sneered, the words triggering a collective gasp that rippled through the packed courtroom. Camera flashes captured Alito's confident smirk as he leaned back, clearly expecting to intellectually dominate this freshman lawmaker. But Crockett, the former criminal defense attorney who had risen from the Texas state legislature to Congress, didn't flinch. Her gaze, steady and unwavering, locked onto Alito's as she adjusted the microphone. The 82-year-old justice had been laying verbal traps for liberal advocates for decades. Today, he thought he'd found an easy target in Crockett. What happened next left the entire courtroom stunned and may forever change how Supreme Court justices approach congressional testimony. But before we delve into the full, astonishing details of this confrontation, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss our upcoming deep dives into the political showdowns that are truly reshaping America. The ornate Supreme Court chamber crackled with palpable tension that morning. On one side sat Justice Samuel Alito, his black robe crisp and immaculate, his face a stern mask perfected over 17 years on the nation's highest court. At 82, Alito had become the unquestioned intellectual leader of the court's conservative wing. A Princeton and Yale law graduate, appointed by President George W. Bush, he had authored some of the court's most controversial decisions. The cameras panned to show Alito shuffling through papers, occasionally glancing up with narrowed eyes at the witness table. His reputation preceded him: meticulous, sharp, and utterly unforgiving to those he deemed unprepared. Court watchers knew his technique well: lure witnesses into contradicting themselves, then pounce with devastating precision. Today, his target was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Justice Alito has requested this special hearing to address congressional concerns about the court's ethics standards, announced Chief Justice Roberts, his voice formal and resonant, echoing through the chamber. Conservative supporters nodded approvingly from the gallery. Alito had publicly criticized Congress for what he called inappropriate meddling in the court's affairs. Now, he intended to put these lawmakers firmly in their place, starting with Crockett. Across the chamber sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 43, representing Texas's 30th congressional district. A former criminal defense and civil rights lawyer, she had quickly carved out a formidable reputation since entering Congress last year. Her rapid-fire questioning style had left corporate CEOs and government officials stammering in congressional hearings. But this was different. This was the Supreme Court's own turf. Crockett sat calmly reviewing her notes. Unlike most representatives facing the intimidating setting of the Supreme Court, she showed no signs of nervousness. Her staff had tirelessly worked through the night, preparing her with key facts about Alito's record, including several contradictions that had largely gone unnoticed by the media. What Alito didn't know was that Crockett had brought her own arsenal of evidence, digital receipts that would systematically dismantle his carefully constructed public persona. Court observers sensed the significance of the moment. This wasn't just about ethics regulations, it was about power. The delicate constitutional balance between Congress and the court, now personified in this showdown between an established justice and a rising congressional star. The stakes couldn't be higher. Public trust in the Supreme Court had fallen to historic lows after a series of ethics scandals. Today's hearing could either restore faith in the institution or deal it another devastating blow. Behind closed doors before the hearing, Crockett's senior advisor had whispered, "He'll try to trap you with hypotheticals. He's been doing this for decades." Crockett had simply nodded, "I've faced tougher judges in Texas with clients' lives on the line. Let him try." The confrontation began with deceptive politeness. Justice Alito smiled thinly as Crockett was recognized to speak. "Congresswoman Crockett, welcome to the Supreme Court. I understand you have concerns about our ethical standards." Crockett thanked him with equal formality. "Justice Alito, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss these important matters. The American people deserve transparency from all branches of government. That's when Alito launched his first strike. Leaning forward, microphone crackling, he said, "Transparency is indeed important, but wouldn't you agree, Congresswoman, that the Constitution establishes the court's independence precisely to shield it from political pressure? Or do you believe Congress should control the judiciary?" The trap was precisely laid. Agree, and she would undermine her own position; disagree, and she'd appear constitutionally ignorant. Spectators tensed, leaning forward, anticipating Crockett might stumble. "Justice Alito, I wouldn't frame it that way," Crockett responded smoothly, a subtle shift in her posture the only hint of the gravity. "The Constitution establishes checks and balances between branches, not isolation. Congressional oversight is part of that system, not an infringement upon it." Alito's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. This wasn't going according to script. He quickly pivoted. "Let me be more specific, then. You've suggested justices should disclose private travel arrangements. Would you apply the same standard to congressional travel?" "Absolutely," Crockett replied without hesitation. "I've publicly disclosed every trip I've taken since entering office. The question is why members of this court haven't done the same." The audience murmured. Alito's face tightened. This wasn't going according to plan. "Time to escalate." "Congresswoman," Alito pressed, his voice rising slightly, the first hint of genuine emotion cracking through his judicial veneer, "perhaps you're unaware of the security concerns justices face daily. Disclosures of the kind you demand would put our safety at risk. Is that what you want?" Crockett remained unfazed. "Justice Alito, with respect, members of Congress face similar threats. Yet, we managed to disclose our travel while maintaining security. Are you suggesting the protocols that protect elected officials couldn't protect justices?" Before Alito could respond, Crockett continued, "But let's address your deeper concern. You've publicly stated that congressional ethics proposals threaten judicial independence. Yet in 2010, you attended political fundraisers without disclosure. Isn't that the very definition of politicizing the court?" Gasps, louder this time, rippled through the chamber. Alito's face flushed a deep crimson. "That's a mischaracterization of private events I attended years ago," he shot back. Crockett nodded to her aide, who swiftly handed her a tablet. "I have here photographs from the Heritage Foundation dinner in 2010 where you were listed as a special guest while the organization openly solicited donations. Would you like to see them, Justice Alito?" The tension in the room reached a breaking point, a palpable hum of disbelief. Alito glanced wildly at Chief Justice Roberts, clearly hoping for intervention, but Roberts remained stone-faced, his expression unreadable, unwilling to inflame the situation further. "Congresswoman," Alito said, his voice now ice-cold, cutting through the silence. "You seem to misunderstand the difference between educational events and political fundraising. This is precisely why Congress should not meddle in judicial affairs. You lack the context to make these distinctions." It was a calculated, direct attack on her intelligence, and the entire room felt the sting. Some conservative justices shifted uncomfortably. Alito had crossed an unspoken line. Crockett paused, letting the condescension hang in the air for all to witness, the silence amplifying its weight. Then she spoke, her voice steady but firm, cutting through the quiet. "Justice Alito, I didn't attend Harvard or Yale, but I did graduate from law school, pass the bar, and win cases before the Texas Supreme Court. I understand perfectly well what constitutes a fundraiser. My question is, do you?" The gallery erupted. Roberts banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order! This is the Supreme Court, not a congressional hearing." Alito, regaining some composure, tried a new approach. "Let me offer you a hypothetical, Congresswoman. If a justice attends an event where, without their knowledge, donations are solicited, is that an ethical violation? How could they possibly prevent such a situation?" It was a classic Alito move, the impossible hypothetical designed to force a contradictory answer. Court watchers had seen him use this technique to dismantle attorneys for years. Crockett didn't take the bait. "That's an interesting scenario, Justice Alito. But we're not discussing hypotheticals today. We're discussing documented events where you were advertised as the guest of honor at fundraisers, events you attended repeatedly after being made aware of their nature. She reached into her folder, producing crisp printouts of email invitations. In fact, I have here 3 separate invitations from subsequent years, all listing you as the keynote speaker, all explicitly mentioning donation levels. These were sent after ethics concerns were raised about your first appearance. The room fell silent once more. This was becoming more than a verbal sparring match, it was turning into a full-blown exposé. Some senators in attendance exchanged glances. This was far beyond what anyone had expected. Alito, visibly struggling to maintain his judicial demeanor, tried yet another angle. Congresswoman, let's be honest about what's happening here. This is a politically motivated attack because you disagree with the court's recent decisions. Isn't that the real reason for this spectacle? It was a desperate move, trying to frame her legitimate questions as partisan. But Crockett was ready. Justice Alito, I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, as did you. My concern is whether undisclosed gifts from individuals with cases before the court violate that oath. If asking about private jets, luxury vacations, and real estate deals worth millions is apolitical, then perhaps we have different definitions of politics. The Chief Justice, sensing the hearing spiraling wildly beyond his control, announced a 15-minute recess, his voice strained. As the justices filed out, cameras caught Alito leaning over to whisper something to Justice Thomas, his face a mask of furious concentration. Crockett, meanwhile, remained calmly at the table, reviewing her notes, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips as her staff showed her something on a phone screen, something that made her eyebrows raise slightly. When the session resumed, everyone knew the real battle was just beginning. When the Supreme Court reconvened after the tense recess, the atmosphere had unmistakably shifted. News of the confrontation had already exploded across social media, #Crockett TVs and #Alito were trending nationwide. Reporters outside the court were broadcasting live updates about the unexpected showdown. Justice Alito returned with a composed expression, clearly having used the break to regroup. Chief Justice Roberts addressed the chamber before proceedings continued. I'd like to remind everyone that this is a formal hearing, not an adversarial proceeding. We will maintain the decorum expected in this courtroom. Alito nodded appreciatively at Roberts before turning back to Crockett. His strategy had visibly shifted. No more attempts to trap her with abstract hypotheticals. Now, he would try to overwhelm her with brute legal precedent. Congresswoman Crockett, Alito began, since you've raised concerns about ethics, let's discuss the legal foundations. In Caperton v. A.T. Massey Coal Company, the court established that mere friendships or associations don't constitute conflicts of interest. The standard requires a direct financial interest in case outcomes. Do you disagree with this established precedent? Alito sat back, confident. He had cited a complex case that even many lawyers struggled to fully understand. The implication was clear, this was beyond Crockett's depth. But Crockett didn't hesitate. Justice Alito, I'm very familiar with Caperton. In fact, that case established that even the probability of bias can violate due process. The court found that a $3 million campaign contribution created such a probability. How then would you characterize a justice accepting undisclosed gifts worth millions from parties with interests before this very court? Alito blinked, clearly not expecting her to counter with the case's actual holding rather than his selective interpretation. Those are very different circumstances, he began, but Crockett continued. Different how, exactly? In Caperton, the court recognized that even without explicit quid pro quo, certain relationships create an unconstitutional risk of bias. When Justice Thomas failed to disclose luxury trips funded by Harlan Crow, who had interests before this court, how was that materially different? The chamber went silent, a collective intake of breath. Crockett had just directly addressed the elephant in the room, the ethics scandals that had rocked the court over the past year, unnamed names. Alito's expression darkened. Congresswoman, it's inappropriate to single out my colleagues in this forum. Justice Thomas isn't here to defend himself. That's when Crockett played her master stroke. She nodded to an aide who handed her another document. "You're absolutely right, Justice Alito. So, let's focus on you instead." She held up the paper, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I have here financial disclosures showing you failed to recuse yourself from cases involving companies in which you owned stock. In Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, you participated despite holding Chevron shares. Would you like to explain that decision?" The gallery erupted again, a louder, more visceral reaction this time. Even Roberts looked visibly stunned, a rare crack in his judicial composure. Alito's face went from flushed to an ashen pale. "Those holdings were in a managed account." "I wasn't directly aware," he started. "A managed account you were legally required to monitor for conflicts," Crockett interjected, her voice sharp. "And this wasn't an isolated incident. I have documentation of at least 7 cases where you participated despite similar conflicts." She wasn't finished. Looking directly at Alito, her gaze unyielding, she continued. "But what's most troubling is this." She held up her tablet, now displaying a split screen. On one side, Alito's written opinion criticizing congressional ethics proposals. On the other, a nearly identical passage from a brief submitted by a conservative legal group. "Your public statements opposing ethics reforms contain paragraphs identical to those in briefs submitted by groups that have funded your retreats. Did you write this opinion, Justice Alito, or did they?" The silence that followed was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket. Cameras captured Alito's stunned, utterly defeated expression as he finally grasped the full extent of the turnaround. He wasn't questioning her competence anymore. He was desperately defending his own integrity. "This is outrageous," Alito finally sputtered. "You come to this court with baseless accusations. And are you saying these documents are forgeries, Justice Alito?" Crockett asked calmly, her voice unwavering. "Because they're all public records. Records that the American people have a right to see and understand." The crowning moment came when Crockett pulled out one final document. "Justice Alito, in 2018, you gave a speech claiming lifetime appointments shield the court from political pressure. Yet in 2010, you were caught on camera mouthing not true during a State of the Union address, a plainly political response to the president. Last year, you told a reporter that criticism of the court was crossing a line." She looked up from her papers, directly into his eyes. "My question is simple: if the Supreme Court is truly above politics, as you claim, why do you repeatedly engage in political behavior while demanding immunity from oversight?" The chamber erupted into utter chaos. Roberts banged his gavel repeatedly, his face stern, but the uproar was too great to quell. Several senators stood up, some applauding openly, others shouting objections. Reporters furiously typed on their phones, their fingers flying, capturing every detail of the historic confrontation. Through it all, Crockett remained composed, her evidence spread before her like a victorious general's spoils. Alito, the master questioner who had intimidated countless lawyers over decades, sat speechless, utterly unable to counter the mountain of evidence she had methodically presented. It wasn't just that she had defended herself from his traps, she had completely flipped the hearing, transforming from the question to the questioner, from the accused to the prosecutor. "Recess!" Roberts finally bellowed over the din, his voice hoarse. "This hearing will resume tomorrow morning." But everyone knew there was no coming back from this. The damage was done. As the justices filed out, cameras caught Alito's defeated expression, a stark contrast to Crockett's resolute composure. Outside the court, a crowd had gathered, watching the proceedings on their phones. When Crockett emerged, spontaneous applause broke out. She had done what many thought impossible: she had held a Supreme Court justice accountable on his own turf. The aftermath of the Alito-Crockett confrontation spread like wildfire across America. As the sun set on Washington that evening, the video of the exchange had already racked up 12 million views. Every major network abandoned planned programming to analyze the historic showdown, which many were already calling a turning point for judicial accountability. CNN's banner headline read, "Supreme Showdown, Crockett exposes Alito's contradictions." Fox News took a different angle with congressional overreach, Crockett attacks Supreme Court independence. But even their legal analysts admitted she had come extraordinarily prepared with irrefutable documentation. Social media exploded with reaction, #Alito's reckonings and #Crockett has receipts dominated trending topics. A clip of Crockett asking, "Do you disagree with your own words, Justice Alito?" had been viewed 40 million times by midnight. Memes comparing Alito's confident beginning expression to his stunned final look spread across platforms. Former law clerks and Supreme Court reporters weighed in, most expressing shock at Crockett's level of preparation. "I've covered the court for 30 years, said veteran legal correspondent Nina Tottenberg on NPR, her voice conveying a rare blend of shock and admiration, "and I've never seen a justice so thoroughly fact-checked in real time." The documentation Congresswoman Crockett presented was meticulous. By morning, the political implications were becoming clear. The White House issued a careful statement: "The administration respects the independence of the judiciary, but also supports appropriate transparency measures for all branches of government." Behind the scenes, sources reported intense discussions about potential Supreme Court ethics legislation that had previously been considered dead on arrival. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called the hearing an unprecedented attack on judicial independence. But 3 moderate Republican senators broke ranks, issuing a joint statement calling for reasonable ethics standards that preserve the court's integrity while ensuring transparency, a significant crack in partisan solidarity. Outside Alito's Georgetown home, reporters gathered hoping for comment. None came, but sources inside the court revealed that an emergency meeting of all 9 justices had been called. Roberts, according to these sources, was furious, not just at Crockett's devastating revelations, but at the fact that the court had been blindsided by documentation that, he reportedly felt, should have been addressed internally years ago. Legal experts began analyzing the potential long-term consequences. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe appeared on MSNBC, explaining, "What makes this extraordinary isn't just that Congresswoman Crockett held Justice Alito accountable. It's that she did so with his own words and actions. This wasn't partisan attack, it was factual exposition." By the following afternoon, the hearing's impact had reached Wall Street. Shares in companies with cases pending before the court that had been linked to justices' financial holdings dipped sharply as investors worried about potential recusals or rehearings. The international reaction was equally significant. The British Guardian ran an editorial titled "America's Judicial Reckoning," while papers from Tokyo to Berlin covered the confrontation as a potential watershed moment for the U.S. judiciary. Former Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer broke the traditional silence of retired justices, telling CBS News, "The court's legitimacy depends on public trust. When that trust is questioned, it's the responsibility of the justices to address concerns transparently, not dismiss them." 3 days after the hearing, the breakthrough came. Chief Justice Roberts announced a stunning development: the Supreme Court would, for the first time in its history, adopt a formal, binding code of ethics with enforcement mechanisms. The code would require disclosure of gifts, travel, and financial interests, with an independent panel to review potential violations. Though Roberts didn't mention Crockett by name, the timing made the connection unmistakable. The court had resisted such measures for decades, but one devastating hearing had accomplished what years of public pressure could not. Crockett herself remained measured in her public response. In her first interview following the hearing, she told 60 Minutes, this was never about attacking the court as an institution. It was about strengthening it. A Supreme Court that operates with transparency is a stronger, more trusted court. That's all I've advocated for. Asked about her preparation for the confrontation with Alito, she smiled slightly. "I am a lawyer by training. I don't ask questions I don't already know the answers to. Justice Alito expected to teach me a lesson about the Constitution. Instead, I think we all learned something about accountability." Legal historians began comparing the hearing to other watershed moments in Supreme Court history. Yale law professor Akhil Redamar called it potentially as significant as Marbury versus Madison in establishing that no branch of government is above scrutiny. For Alito personally, the repercussions were swift. 2 weeks after the hearing, he announced he would recuse himself from 5 pending cases involving companies in which he had undisclosed interests. Anonymous sources within the court reported that his influence among the other justices had diminished significantly. Conservative legal groups that had once celebrated Alito as their champion now faced difficult questions about their relationships with sitting justices. Several announced they would no longer invite justices to speak at fundraising events, ending a long-standing practice. For Crockett, the hearing transformed her from a freshman representative to a national figure overnight. Law schools across the country invited her to speak. Young lawyers cited her methodical dismantling of Alito's arguments as an inspiration. "She showed us that preparation and facts still matter," said one Harvard law student in an interview. "That speaking truth to power isn't just a slogan." 6 months after the hearing, Congress passed the Judicial Ethics and Transparency Act with surprising bipartisan support. The bill codified many of the measures Roberts had voluntarily adopted, ensuring they couldn't be reversed by future courts. Perhaps the most lasting impact came in public perception. A Gallup poll showed trust in the Supreme Court, which had hit historic lows before the hearing, rebounded significantly after the adoption of ethics reforms. Americans across the political spectrum expressed renewed confidence that the court's decisions were based on law rather than ideology or financial interests. The final word perhaps belonged to a retired federal judge who wrote in the Yale Law Journal, "The Alito-Crockett confrontation reminds us that our system of checks and balances requires courage to function. When branches of government fail to check themselves, the Constitution provides mechanisms for others to do so." Congresswoman Crockett did not undermine the court's authority, she helped restore it by insisting on its integrity. As for Justice Alito, he continued to serve on the court, though with a noticeably lower public profile. The justice who had once proudly claimed the court was above politics now rarely gave public speeches or interviews. 1 year to the day after the hearing, a package arrived at Crockett's congressional office. Inside was a copy of the Constitution with a brief note. "Some fights are worth having. Thank you for having this one." It was signed by a law student who wrote that she had decided to pursue a career in public service after watching Crockett that day. The Alito-Crockett confrontation had begun as a routine oversight hearing and ended as a pivotal, unforgettable moment in American legal history, proving once again that in a democracy, no power is absolute, and no institution is beyond accountability. If you found this breakdown of the historic Alito-Crockett confrontation enlightening and inspiring, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this video with friends who care about the future of our democratic institutions. Drop a comment below telling us which political showdown you'd like us to cover next. New videos every Tuesday and Friday. We'll see you in the next one, where we'll be examining another pivotal moment reshaping American democracy.